Fallout 4 has been out for nearly 8 years, and while many of its secrets have been explored, its code searched through extensively, there's still things that we forget to think about. The NPCs of Fallout 4. Not the main characters we see and talk to, such as Nick Valentine, Hancock or Piper, Kate, or any of the other companions. Nor the characters we interact with during quests, such as Billy or Quinlan. No, I'm talking about the NPCs that we may not be able to interact with. The NPCs that we can only meet through what remains of them. Their notes, their terminal entries, the holotapes they left behind for friends, families, and coworkers. Characters such as we explore today, the Fens Street Phantom. The Fens Street Phantom was a pre-war killer in Boston. From the sewer we find their base in Dumping Grounds Inn, we can tell that he was one that caused a large amount of fear in the pre-war era Boston. The first holotape that we find from the Fens Phantom is by the entrance of the sewer, and meant for an unknown detective who has followed unknown notes or holotapes to the sewer, unlike us who stumble upon it. As we go through the rest of the sewer, we find 3 other holotapes, all talking about the Fens Phantom's connection to this unknown detective. It's a one-sided conversation meant for the detective, but they're long gone, and we're one of the only few to hear its message. Now, right off the bat, I personally don't think that the detective ever got to the sewers, just by the fact that the holotapes are still there when we find them so many years later. And the skeletal remains are still there with no attempt to take them away for burial or evidence. Or maybe the detective did get them there and just set them down after listening. Or maybe they just never showed as they wanted to get back up, or maybe we'll never know. But regardless, I doubt the detective ever entered the sewers to confront the Fens Street Phantom as the killer hoped for. And also with this, I want to say that I don't think the Fens Street Phantom survived the fallout. There's talk about the glowing one ghoul being the Phantom, which is a really interesting theory, but it's one that I don't necessarily believe. We've seen other ghouls that have been named, such as Nate and Nora's former neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Donahue, Mr. and Mrs. Parker, and other pre-war sanctuary residents. Despite the 200 years that have passed since then, we still know them. I feel like Bethesda would have named the glowing one ghoul the Fens Street Phantom, or something similar, had this been intentional. But who knows? Anyways, the tapes. The 4 tapes, at least to me, sound like they were recorded before the detective made their way to the sewers. The 4th one to me doesn't sound like a confession, but a sick sort of promise from the Fens Street Phantom to the detective. It's clear that there's some sort of relationship between the two, but what exactly that relationship is, I'm not quite sure. It could be a possessive one based off the Dear Detective tapes. The Phantom openly admits that he is anxious and only ever wanted someone to know me. It sounds like a serial killer killing for attention almost. And the whole series of tapes themselves sound like a personal confession to the detective. In the first 2 tapes, the Fens Phantom says that he'd very much like you to see it, and I'm happy to share it with you today, detective, referring to the bodies of his victims. It sounds almost excited, like someone showing artwork rather than the gruesome murders that they are. Whatever the relationship is, it's strange. The Phantom clearly wants some sort of connection to the detective. He wants to be close, and it's that causes me to question why there's no holotapes from the detective side, just for the detective. I think it's a really interesting choice on Bethesda to not include anything about the Fens Street Phantom from somebody else. There's nothing mentioned in the numerous police terminals, no logged evidence, no reports, no mentions of anything, killings, or holotapes that could tie to the Fens Street Phantom. It would have been such a great thing to include in any one of the holotapes, especially since Police Precinct 8 is so close by to the sewer, and so much more could have been found there, giving us a whole nother side to the story. But we don't see anything from the detective's point of view. Nothing to corroborate or contrast with the information from the Fens Street Phantom's own view. Even without it, of course, we can still see the crimes of the Phantom, clearly, as he laid out the remains of his victims on display for the detective to find. And as much as I'm upset that we don't get much more from the story, I think it was intentional. We're placed in the shoes of pre-war Boston citizens for a moment. The lack of information and knowing. We're stuck wanting to know more, but we cannot. The sewers themselves are something that I find interesting, just as much as I find it horrifying. And it reminds me in a way of the final act of Silence of the Lambs, the basement full of twists and turns. I can almost imagine what Clarice felt, wandering the halls of the basement, waiting for the killer or ghoul to jump out. But where Clarice and Catherine are still alive, the detective and victims of the Fens Street sewer are gone. Taking a look at pre-war Boston and all the remnants of the few surviving things we can find in the city, fear was not coming just from what was happening overseas, but within the states. within the city and within people's own streets. It makes the killer all the more sick to me, preying on already terrified people. The Fens Street Phantom tells us that it wasn't just propaganda, posters, and nuclear war and rationing that citizens of Boston had to fear, but a killer phantom roaming the streets. And everywhere we look, there's posters. War support posters and signage for registering for your place in Vault-Tech Vault. I can only imagine how these posters would make people feel as they went on with their everyday lives, watching as they hang on nearly every wall and supporting the idea of impending doom. And we as a player can only watch and accept it. We can only watch as we find more and more evidence of the lives before the events of Fallout 4, and all the things that cause them fear. My own take on the sewer and the remains of the victim is sadness. It's horrifying. These victims, well, fiction and code, never got justice. Their only burial was in a sewer underneath the city. The only people who can mourn them is ourselves, someone who doesn't know them. It almost reminds me of the Soul Survivor story, and obviously not the same, as the Soul Survivor has the chance to live and get justice. But these victims are just frozen in time, and do not have that second chance. Like I said, these victims are just fiction and code, but I still find it upsetting within the context of Fallout 4, and I think Bethesda intended it like this. A way for us to see not just the horrors of war, but the horrors of humanity in its darkest moments. Bethesda forces us to look at the victims and their skeletal remains, not just add a few more skeletons in the game, or add in a serial killer's lair in the sewer to add some scares and have someone talk in a creepy voice, but to remind the audience of the terror that was plaguing pre-war Boston. I find this fear understandable. From posters to rationing, curfews, and corruption in a killer, all this fear would have been a struggle to go through every day. It makes me think that the people pre-war were just as brave as the people after, in their own way, of course, as obviously their lives and survival are vastly different. But I think that each was brave not just to survive, but to live in such a terrifying world. And I think it's an interesting thing to look at. Both have their own struggles and fears, and it truly shows in a way that war indeed never changes. Okay, I'm not going to end on that cliche, so here's a forum post I found while doing some research on this video. So, it looks like someone at Nuka World has admired the Fens Street Sewer Murderer/Phantom. Easter egg? Unorthodoxly noticed this, and I found it pretty interesting that there's this neat little Easter egg in Nuka Cola World, especially considering I could definitely see the disciples doing this. Plus, it implies that others have seen the Fens Phantom Sewer, which is really interesting to me. Maybe someone took half of some unknown holotape or notes, and now half the story is missing and just waiting to be found. The Fens Phantom is a character that I wish we knew more of. Not necessarily from his perspective, but from maybe notes in police terminals or holotapes scattered around the Commonwealth, creating conversation between the killer and detective. Maybe in another DLC or mod or content creation. But until then, we can keep creating our own theories. And that's episode 2. I'm curious to hear all your thoughts on the Fens Phantom, as it's one of the mysteries of Fallout 4 that hasn't fully yet been uncovered. And there's still so much speculation about who the Phantom was, who the detective was, what their relationship was like. Let me know in the comments. I'll be checking them if you have anything to add, or want to just talk about the game. The next episode will be released Wednesday, and I hope to see you there for more analysis on Forgotten NPCs.